This one's a bit of a maverick talk. I'm going to talk about carbon, but not in a hydrocarbon context, and in 5 minutes, so it's going to be a bit of a challenge. So this is a large group effort between myself and a whole bunch of co-authors listed down here. Let's see, go into projection mode. Now, you're all familiar with the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt, which is a well-known concept describing the global network of ocean currents distributing heat and moisture around the globe. But there's another lesser known but much older and slower belt, the Earth's carbon conveyor belt, and that's depicted here. It shifts massive amounts of carbon between the deep Earth and the surface and plays a pivotal role in Earth's climate, the evolution of life, and things like diamond formation. This belt is controlled by mid-ocean ridges and deep-sea trenches. It moves just a few centimeters per year, and it can take tens of millions of years to complete a loop, shedding and collecting carbon at various locations along the way. Carbon is released into the oceans and the atmosphere at mid-ocean ridges during seafloor spreading. Then carbon gets stored in the plate, in the mantle, where carbon is assimilated from the convecting mantle into the lithospheric mantle. Carbon is assimilated into the crust by hydrothermal circulation and sequestered into deep sea sediments that collect pelagic biogenic sediments. There's also serpentinization going on when very slow spreading occurs, or also where the plate bends before entering the subduction zone. And this serpentinization process accumulates additional carbon in the plate. So we're going to have a quick look how this conveyor belt works and how it completes a loop and what happens to the carbon that ends up being subducted. Of course, some of it comes back out along volcanic arcs, but some keeps on going into the deeper mantle. So what controls this carbon conveyor belt is mid-ocean ridge length and subduction zone length, shown up here. Then we have mean spreading rates and convergence rates. And the product of mid-ocean ridge length and spreading rates gives us crust production rates. And then from the production rates, we ultimately obtain consumption rates along subduction zones. What's also important is the mean age of the subducted ocean crust. And the age is important because most of the processes that accumulate carbon in oceanic plates are age dependent in different ways. And so we've got to know the age area distribution of the plate through time. We need to know two other tectonic parameters. We need to know something about the prevalence of sediment accretion versus erosion along subduction trenches, because this determines how much of the sediment that arrives at a trench actually keeps on going down versus sediment that's being accreted to the overriding plate, contributing to crustal growth. And so we have a shortcut to approximate this ratio through time. Then the last element here is the shallow slab dip. The slab dip at subduction zones is important because how much the plate curves at subduction zones controls how much it falls, and this in turn drives the serpentinization along the outer rise of the plate. So this is a little video that Ben Mather has put together that is focused on the driving forces of the carbon conveyor belt. So what's shown here is the spreading rates along mid-ocean ridge segments in red and convergence rates in blue. And so we see Pangaea going through the cycle of breaking up. Mid-ocean ridge lengths doubled in this process and vastly accelerated the workings of the carbon conveyor belt. Now, what this next video is showing is the carbon area density through time, and you see time playing on the upper left here, of oceanic plates. And you see not a hell of a lot of carbon was sequestered into plates early on, and we see brighter and brighter colors popping up here as time goes by, meaning that more and more carbon gets sequestered into oceanic plates. And the reason for this is found in the evolution of biogenic pelagic carbonate producers. These little critters didn't exist before the Cretaceous period. And so before the Cretaceous period, sequestration of carbon into the plate was entirely driven by processes in the crust and the mantle, and the sediments might have had a bit of organic carbon, but they didn't have any carbonates. Right? So this ends up being important, as we'll see in a minute. So if we look at the carbon area density in the oceanic lithosphere through time, from old, 250 million years ago, down here, to young, present. So these bright pink colors that show up here exemplify this enormous growth of the oceanic biogenic carbon reservoir that didn't exist at all in the Triassic and Jurassic. So now what we can do, we can compute some summary statistics. We can have a look at the carbon flux into the plate through time. So we have time from 250 million years ago to the present on the x-axis, and we have carbon flux into the plate on the y-axis at the top. The gray is the total, and the green and reddish components are the components in the crust and the mantle, and the blue is the carbonate sediments. And you see how this component shoots up in the late Cretaceous and the Cenozoic, when these carbonate producers evolved and developed the capacity to ultimately dominate a carbon sequestration of the oceanic carbon conveyor belt. So then we can look at the subduction flux as well. Of course, as we accumulate carbon on the plate, it then takes some time for these parcels of ocean crust to arrive at the subduction zone. So with some delay, we see a very significant increase in the subduction of carbonate sediments. That's the blue graph here, the blue curve on the lower graph. And while crustal and mantle carbon, this is the green and the red curve down here, are much more important before. And the only reason why there's a peak of subducting crustal and mantle carbon in the mid-Cretaceous is because the speed of the global plate tectonic system went into overdrive, into a slab superflux mode, when we had very fast seafloor spreading and very long ridge lengths and equivalently very high subduction speeds. So we get these two peaks. And so now we're going to have a look at the carbon burial grounds. We've heard about the slab burial grounds earlier today. Right? And so what's colored here is the carbon area density, essentially in the upper mantle, that reflects the cumulative subduction of carbon into the mantle. So the brighter the colors, the more carbon has been inserted into the mantle. And the little inset graph shows the mean evolution of carbon sequestration into the mantle through time. So there's not much happening while Pangaea was assembled in the Triassic and early Jurassic. Then as Pangaea started breaking up, we form all these new mid-ocean ridges, and the plate tectonic system starts going faster, and ultimately we store more carbon in the oceanic plates, and we also subduct more carbon into the mantle. And so much of what we see here is really driven by carbon sequestration into the mantle in the last sort of 130 million years, I would say, because there wasn't really a hell of a lot going on before this time. Now, what we can also do, we can then look at the carbon that's going down. So we know that's going down into the mantle, but what happens to it afterwards, right? Now, some of this carbon will be degassed at sort of sub-arc depths. That's the upper 125 kilometers, right? And we figure out how much carbon each one of these reservoirs that we have discussed releases by using thermodynamic modeling. We use the Perplex software to do this. We're working with Chris Gonzalez and Veronica Gorczyk at UWA for this purpose, because they're experts in thermodynamic modeling. And these models tell us that the crust and the mantle get nearly 100% devolatilized into the shallow mantle, right? As on their way down, they lose all the carbon relatively quickly, whereas the sediments are surprisingly resistant to devolatilization. Once they've lost much of their water, carbon tends to stick to these sediments, right? And so what we are showing, so the gray graph here is the total carbon slab outflux into the subarctic mantle. And so this stuff will then either ultimately reach the atmosphere or melts will percolate into the overriding plate and get stuck as magmas or cause volcanism or cause metamorphic reactions, right? And so one of the intriguing things that the carbon that's going down into the mantle does is it helps form diamonds. But diamonds mostly form at depths between 200 and 300 kilometers. So we need to look at the carbon that isn't devolatilized at very shallow depths, but that keeps on traveling into the deeper mantle, right? And then gradually it also makes its way into the surrounding mantle, and it forms a belt in the uppermost mantle where carbon is enriched, accompanied by other volatiles. And what we are showing on the right-hand side here is the transport of carbon to these deeper mantle depths, and the blue is again the sediments, and the green and the reddish colors are the other components. And we can see right away how the blue curve dominates what's happening here. So much of the carbonate sediments that go down in larger and larger quantities in the late Cretaceous and the Cenozoic, and they don't get devolatilized at shallow depths. They keep on traveling to deeper depths, but then ultimately they get dispersed in the upper part of the upper mantle, or some of it also makes it down into the transition zone. Right? And so what we observe is, so we have these two peaks. So this is when sedimentary carbon first becomes really prominent and being subducted in the mid-Cretaceous, and then it goes even higher here in the latest Cretaceous, early Tertiary, right? And it turns out that these two peaks are actually related to two kimberlite peaks in North America. Of course, North America and South America are two of the primary places where there's a lot of sedimentary carbonate going down the subduction zones, right? And it turns out in North America, we find a lot of young diamonds formed in the late Cretaceous and Paleogene. And they are shown on this map from a paper by Beeman et al. In Lithos 2003. So there are these belts of diamonds that parallel the subduction zone in Western North America. And we think that these diamonds exist because CO2-rich fluids were released from the subducting slab, made mostly from carbonate sediments. They help generate carbonatitic melts by interacting with the deeper parts of the mantle wedge peridotites, creating a shallow mantle carbon reservoir. And then ultimately, this becomes the source of kimberlite carbonate magmatism, especially during periods of shallow slab subduction, which is what we had in the late Cretaceous and before 50 million years ago, exactly at the time when these things were emplaced. And those of you familiar with the work by Trond Torsvik and others who had a paper in Nature in 2010 focused on kimberlites, and especially diamondiferous kimberlites being mostly related to mantle plumes and the edges of LLSVPs, you will notice that there's a cloud of points on his map here that he couldn't explain. These are all the North American diamonds, right, that are clearly not related to mantle plumes or LLSVPs, right? And we think that we have a story for these diamonds, and we now understand why they're there. Thank you.